There are many events throughout the Cold War that led to the hope of détente, an end to the conflict. For example, the establishment of the hotline and the signing of the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963 after that Cuban Missile Crisis. There were several other nuclear treaties signed to get some semblance of control over that nuclear arms race. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968 limited the number of weapons by stating only those countries that already have nukes are allowed to have them. It seems like an odd treaty to sign. It's kind of like those who are in the club get to stay but no new members. But the focus was to stop the spread or proliferation by not sharing the technology secrets with those nation states who didn't already have the technology. In 1972, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT, was signed to limit the number of ICBMs being built and limit the number of anti-ballistic missile sites, or ABMs. Why limit ABM sites? Because these sites are defensive instead of offensive. So if you have a bunch of ABM sites that protect your area from nuclear missiles, it gets rid of the deterrent, that idea of mutual assured destruction. You don't want countries to think they can launch such deadly weapons without worrying about the fact that they could also be destroyed. That would make the nation-state reckless. There was a SALT II treaty, but it wasn't signed due to the conflict in Afghanistan in the 1980s. In 1982, the START, or Strategic Arms Reduction talks, moved to reduce the actual number of armaments. In other words, while SALT wanted to slow down the number of new weapons being built, START would actually start to destroy some of those stockpiles. As with some of the previous treaties, the United States actually had an advantage because cruise missiles weren't included. It was a new technology. In 1983, President Reagan announced the development of the Strategic Defense Initiative. The rest of us nicknamed it Star Wars. This looked at various methods of intercepting missiles in space through the launching of satellites with interceptor missiles, laser X-ray beams, and other projectiles. Seriously, not only have all the tests shown that it really can't work, it also violates several treaties, like the SALT Treaty, because it's an anti-ballistic missile site in space. As well, there's a treaty that states both superpowers should not put anything into space that can launch nuclear missiles and wage war in space. In 1987, we saw the signing of the INF Treaty. It stands for the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force, and it reduces the arsenal of smaller weapons. It meant the destruction of almost 2,700 warheads, which freaks me out a bit that there were that many to destroy and they still have a stockpile left over. An important part of this treaty is that the superpowers could inspect each other's arsenal. Previously, the Cold War tensions prevented them from allowing inspectors to come into their nation state. Now we can see détente really forming as the two opponents begin to trust each other. Now, these nuclear treaties aren't the only tools to bring about détente. For example, the United States wanted to establish relations with communist China, but of course they can't look like they're soft on communism. So President Nixon supports the organization of a ping pong tournament. Seriously, it was an excuse for the leaders to meet. So this is called ping pong diplomacy, and it led to improved relations between these two powers. The United States agreed to accept the communist leader of China as the legitimate government, and therefore had a right to sit on the Security Council. Another example would be the Helsinki Accords that was signed in 1975 after 10 years of negotiation. The two superpowers, along with several other European countries and Canada, signed this agreement. It included a rejection of interventionist policies like the Truman Doctrine and the Brezhnev Doctrine. It settled European border issues that had been a problem since World War II and encouraged humanitarian cooperation and respect for human rights. This opened the door to some of the protest movements in the Soviet sphere of influence, as can be seen in the quote here. So how does it all end? Reagan uses the idea of the evil empire to get support for increased military spending. His trickle-down economics and that his supply-side economic policies didn't work so well at getting the U.S. out of debt because he increased military spending by $2.2 trillion. Well, the stagnant Soviet economy just couldn't compete with this level of spending, even though they were actually spending a higher percentage of their GDP on the military than the Americans. But that was because of the uprisings in satellite states and the war in Afghanistan. Remember, this is the Afghan war in the 80s, not the 2000s. As Gorbachev continues to promote glasnost and perestroika, Reagan adopts a more peaceful stance. Instead of calling them the evil empire, he calls out Gorbachev to prove that he's not all talk. Gorbachev did, in fact, implement many of the economic and political reforms, but unfortunately for him, instead of solving the problems of dictatorial socialism, it just led to the downfall of the Soviet Empire. The fall of the Berlin Wall, that was the symbolic break in the Iron Curtain. Satellite states throughout the communist bloc found their people were no longer willing to accept communist rule. They wanted the liberalism enjoyed in the West. But the problem was they didn't have the institutions or the ideological background to easily switch to a liberal society. In addition to the economy stumbling, ethnic conflict started to grow as people were allowed to express their opinions. People became more aware of problems in society like prostitution and drugs. There were seniors who couldn't believe the stories that were coming out on the free press, telling them that Stalin was not a wonderful father figure, but instead a monster who killed millions of people. What's interesting is that at the end of the 1980s, we basically see Eisenhower's domino theory, where he feared the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, happen in reverse. The Warsaw Pact dissolves, the several states break away from the Soviet bloc, and then the Soviet Union itself breaks into pieces. By 1991, the USSR no longer exists and becomes Russia once again. And of course, if there's no threat between the superpowers, there's no Cold War. So the end of the Cold War created an odd situation. After years of world wars, then a 45-year Cold War, suddenly the US was the sole superpower. We'd given the US the role of the world's policeman, going around with the threat of force to stop the spread of communism and tyranny. NATO, which had been created as a military alliance to help with this goal, suddenly had to question whether or not it still needed to exist now that the Soviet threat was gone. In the early 1990s, many people hoped for what was referred to as the New World Order and the peace dividend. Why not take the opportunity to reduce military budgets and funnel all of the millions of dollars that have been spent on fighting the Cold War and use it for humanitarian purposes? Unfortunately, we actually ended up seeing an increase in military spending, but that was due to things like the terrorist threats of the 2000s. But to get back to the New World Order, now the UN could play a greater role since the superpowers wouldn't be threatening to use their veto in the Security Council. We saw an early test of this in the 1991 Gulf War. Iraq invaded their neighbor Kuwait over an oil field dispute. The UN put sanctions on Iraq and then set a deadline for Iraq to evacuate Kuwait. When Iraq refused, the UN used peacemaking for the first time since the Korean War. An international military coalition was able to easily defeat Iraq in a month, with only actually a few days of fighting, the rest of it being missile strikes into Iraq from warships and jets in the Gulf. So now the world can be a safer place with collective security being handled by the UN. But that momentary success was short-lived. The New World Order didn't mean a more peaceful world. Instead, we saw a significant increase in the number of civil wars, like Somalia, Rwanda, Haiti, Yugoslavia, Sudan. During the Cold War, the superpowers would quell these uprisings in countries within their spheres of influence. But now that those spheres had essentially disappeared, so did the outside influence. Today, NATO sees its role clearly as a defender against tyranny and terrorism. It can more easily take action against a rogue nation than the UN, which is often hampered by strict rules against violating sovereignty. For example, NATO led the mission in Afghanistan that started in 2002 after the 9/11 attacks. The military-industrial complex Eisenhower worried about still exists today, with lobbyists paid to influence politicians in Western nations and millions of dollars in sales to warlords around the world. So while the Cold War has ended, it doesn't mean an end to global conflicts.